Okay.
You want to know what's so wrong with my thought? When you said that, initially, no. When you said I'm gonna fight the law and I'm gonna win, I was like, it's because you're white, and I'm like, oh no. My thought is just
No.
So,
That was my first thought too.
I'm
gonna fight the
This
law
is what I'm
and
talking
because the
about.
cop's not gonna be there. Fight back.
I know, like that's the point of your
I didn't get
story.
invited.
okay.
My mind is
We have to
definitely
go
like,
back. I'm sorry, but I'm glad that you're gonna win and not pay attention.
I'm glad that somebody said that.
So we looked at the different principles, and everyone's gonna have a different perspective, and then obviously context is gonna change as well. So if it's a huge social justice issue, that's probably gonna be the main focus. Oh no! Don't tell me this is not. Oh, probably okay. You plug this in. Oh. Is that working? I don't know if that works. Sorry, guys. I just don't know. Okay, we'll see. Okay, so those are the ethical rule screens. You can look more at the descriptions in the text, and then it talks a little bit about issues coming up. So, like, at times, self-determination might be top priority because there's not an imminent issue of protection of life. And so they vary. They say that the NSW Code of Ethics does not specify which value, principle, or standard are more important and not to outweigh others in instances of conflict. So you don't really get guidance with that. What you will get is a person's perspective that they think that's the way it is, but there isn't like specific guidance that tells you. And so when faced with ethical conflicts, we utilize the Code of Ethics, the ethical assessment screen, the ethical principles, and our own values to inform the decision-making process. So that's kind of the complexity of the decision-making process. There's a lot of pieces to it. For the paper, you don't have to write a ton, but I do want you guys to kind of go through the text and have a better understanding and be able to kind of show where you fit within those different pieces and your thought process behind there, instead of just like, this is what I do. And again, with ethics, it depends on your theory and your approach. And most of the time with the things you're going to get, there's not a clear right answer. So ethical dilemmas are usually value dilemmas. There's not a clear answer. So it's not like if you can just explain it through those screens, then you can be right, because there's not like a definite, this is the right answer. So now we're getting into the actual like stuff. So I'll start doing practice quizzes and doing videos. You don't have to watch them, but going over why, which are the correct answers, and then why the other ones are not correct, or why that they're partially correct but they don't address the question, so that you guys start getting aware. I'm probably not going to do tricky things like that in your midterm or final, but so that you're starting to think like that for law and ethics for your license. So our they're gonna. Oh no, I'll do some in lecture, and then I'm gonna do videos that just go over. I'll post some practice quizzes, and if you want, you can go over them, and then I'll have the rationale. That's how I learn the most. But some people it might not be. They might just be able to read it and they're fine.
I saw too on campus. You posted a few of the practice quizzes, but it says optional under them, so are they not mandatory? If they're on.
Yeah. I haven't posted, at least haven't made them, because last week's was too theoretical that there wasn't going to be like a multiple choice kind of thing. I'll have links, and then you can use them if you want. This is optional. You don't have to. For everyone, in case you missed it last week, what I would suggest doing is when you get into Canvas, just go to the Pages section, and I'm making modules for each week, and I link everything that you need for that week. You can do it other ways. It's just easier to know, like, if there's not a learning activity linked to it, there's not a learning activity. There's not a discussion. Like, it's just kind of central. You can just go there and click, and everything's there. So the standard of care is what is considered usual and customary professional standard of practice, and it's a minimum standard. So if there's any questions on any of the exams that say standard of care is a maximum standard, it's automatically not right. It's just the bare minimum. If you're meeting this, you're just scooting by. It defines for us what is how a reasonable and prudent practitioner would practice social work. So what are the expectations that once we become social workers that we need to at least meet? It's made up of statutes, ethical codes, Board of Behavioral Science requirements, so that's who license us in California, and general consensus of the personal social work community. So standard of care is legal and ethical, because there's mixes of both within it, because there is laws, but there's also ethics. So when you do like the qualifying, it'll say what are 2 legal considerations, 2 ethical considerations. At some point, I'm working on them right now, but making you guys cheat sheets that tell you where it falls in. Because technically, and you could argue it, if you're like, that's not, you could be like, but I presented it like this, and that is legal, or this is ethical. And probably if you do that, they'll be like, oh, okay. So what are statutes? They're laws that identify the minimum legal requirements to meet the standard of care. So the statutes, like our statute to report child and elder abuse, is a statute that informs our standard of care. If we're not meeting the defined guidelines, we're not meeting the standard of care. Ethical codes are ethical issues that from the NASW Code of Ethics. So this is just breaking down the pieces that make standard of care. The Association of Social Work Board, ASWB, published a Model Social Work Practice Act, further defining standard of care. So I think it was like 2000. They I'm not gonna. You guys don't need to look at it, but there is one out there. They actually created a model because it was a little too challenging to navigate. So they have a model that is generally everyone agrees upon that we can use. BBS requirements cover what is expected for all clinical social workers. This could include the number of hours we must have supervised by a licensed individual, continuing education requirements, and what legal issues need to be reported to the BBS. Consensus of the professional community is based on accepted practices, based on your location of practice and field of practice. So it doesn't mean that it, like when you do DSM, what the DSM is what people have agreed upon. It doesn't mean that if it's on there, it doesn't exist. Like diagnoses that people generally have agreed upon. When you get into diagnosis, they get really political. So like I know one of the ones they wanted to add with sex addiction, there's a lot of moral judgments. Because if you look at just what defines an addiction and someone that's not, they're just an hedonist. You know what I mean? So it's just what people generally are saying is okay and what can be supported. And so it changes. So like DSM, I'm sure next version, new things. New things from the 4 to the 5. It'll always be changing. So we do consider the region. So what's practiced in the region? So I don't think you'll ever experience this, but technically, like if you are practicing social work in a region where bartering is very appropriate and done, you technically could do that. Because you could say this is appropriate for the region. Yeah. So, and then we also look at what practices, so like, for example, one of my first consumers was a female to male transgender teen, and he was trying to get double mastectomy. So he had some like hospitalizations. They need to make sure he was stable. So he had to see me for a certain amount of time for me to say yes, they're stable or not stable. So when I looked for resources, because I was just doing therapy, but I'm a social worker. Like you're always a social worker, even if you're working as a clinical therapist. So my thing was not just to go like, let's do CBT and all this stuff. It was to say, okay, what are the resources that they need to support their recovery or whatever that looks like. So go look for teen transgender groups. None in the Inland Empire. You might be like, what? So I couldn't really refer. There was stuff in like LA. So if something happened and the board is now looking at, did I give them appropriate services? Well, yeah, given the region, there wasn't stuff. But if you're like deep in the heart of LA and you didn't do any of that stuff, they're going to be like, really? Because the region has different resources. You know what I mean? So that's what they consider with standard of care. It does change based on region because you might not have those things accessible. Laws are...
Does it change based on like the quality of the resource? So like, let's say you find a resource, especially for like trans students, that does multiple like aspects of care, where it's like biological care, psychological care, and then social well-being, versus you find resources closer to them, but it's like they gotta go to a different clinic for each one of those things.
No, because you're trying. I mean, it's more looking at were you negligent? So if there was like, say it was like some kind of high-profile case, and the BBS is looking because even though we're working like I was a clinical therapist then, I'm still a social worker. So the way that I conceptualize, I'm looking at whole person, I'm looking at systems. I'm not just looking at the family or like the internal psychology. So if there was some concern, you're trying to link, you're fine. But it'd be like if there was some like very obvious things within your region that you totally could have to help that person. I don't know if they take your license, but they might like reprimand you. But like you're really not trying that hard because there's a lot of things really close, as opposed to if they live in, and I don't know, maybe there's a lot of transgender teens there, but like Nebraska, you're like there's tons, and I'm like okay, I'm not. But yeah, it depends on region. So I just put that in there to understand the regional part. So. Some of the standard of care is just things that we need to do. Like we have to have an assessment and a treatment plan. So there is not a law guiding that. So like you're not going to violate a law. But if something happens and you're like, well, I don't have an assessment or a treatment plan, they're going to be like, seriously? Like you are not meeting the standard of care. And that could illustrate you not meeting the standard of care. So there isn't a law, so you're not breaking a law. But you're not meeting the standard of care. I mean, that's just basic, that you did an assessment and have some goals that you're working towards. Yeah, we talked about that. So there's differences within the communities. We don't have a lot of time to go into the questions, but you want to look at what's available or not available in the community, what's accessible. So like when I worked with homeless people, it was really interesting because all my coworkers made them come to the office. I'm like, they are homeless and have no income. Like, that's kind of weird. Well, they have to get here. Okay. Like, you want to consider those things when you're providing services. There was literally, like, we used to have to email out because they were, like, real micromanaging. And I was parking the county car. It was new. And the smoking section was right there. And this lady's like, are you Mike? I'm like, oh no, I'm only going to get killed. You get to a point, if you work long enough, that if anyone thinks they know you, you have no idea how. Like, did I wrong you? Did I take your baby? Were we best friends in middle school? Like, what's going on? And I'm like, yeah, we're worried about you. I'm like, who are you? Oh, we work in the records. You're out just a lot. Like, just all the time. And I'm like, well, I'm a social worker and I work with homeless people. So I was at an abandoned church where they live. We just don't want you to burn out. I'm like, this is like basic. But they weren't. They were like, well, I didn't see anyone because they didn't come to the clinic. Okay. That makes sense. So the standard of care shifts and it's always changing because different laws, different guidelines, different societal changes happen, and that shifts what we do. Social workers should aim at going above and beyond the standard of care because it's just minimal. So don't make that your aim. You want to go way above and beyond. You want to make sure you're meeting that, but you want to go above and beyond. Scope of practice. So this is a legal issue. Can someone tell me when it gets close? Because I don't. Oh, I do have a clock. Okay, never mind. Is it 5? Just want to make sure the clock's not. You're like, no, it's 5:41. So scope of practice is legal. So if you have to pick a legal issue, scope of practice could totally be one of those things. It is a legal standard that tells us how we practice as social workers, and defines what we can do. Again, when we go to scope of competence, it doesn't mean that we're competent to do it. So we have to consider that as well. It applies to everyone equally within the field, and we cannot expand our scope of practice. We can expand our scope of competency, right? Like I got EMDR trained, so now I can competently say I have EMDR certification, because I literally do. You can't extend your scope of practice. It's just set. You have to actually get more education and go into a different scope of practice to expand it. It doesn't work that way. Whereas scope of competence is you start out with nothing and you can grow it as much or as little as you want. So I talk example, psych testing is great. MFTs can do a little bit. Psychologists can do psych testing. We can't. Super helpful. I'd encourage you, especially if I don't teach your DSM, when you do assessments, especially on children, get the psych testing from the IEP if they have one. And there's the parent, I don't know. They have a triennial every 3 years where they do a battery of psych tests. And they're very important because it can really support your diagnosis and maybe bring up stuff that you're like, you didn't mention any of this. Like on this ranking or, so really, really helpful. Yeah, we can do things like surveys. Like usually if I'm going to use ADHD, I'll send out parent and teacher survey, caregiver and teacher survey, has a series of questions to see if they're actually meeting the criteria. Because usually kids aren't coming in and saying, well, I just can't focus and I'm very hyperactive and fidgety all the time. And I'm failing everything and I'm very impulsive. They're just going to be like, I'm good. Every time. So this is the example. So this actually, the person that supervised my hours did this. I don't think she had ill intention, but technically she's totally violating her scope of practice. So she was a cosmetologist prior. She was also a real estate agent. I'm like, what kind of mom and dad issues did you have? Like, you're good enough. So she was treating depression for clients, and so she did their hair because their focus was hygiene. So technically, that's way out of her scope of practice. Not technically, it is. She does have a cosmetologist license, but that's not the capacity she's working in. Unless Fantastic Sam hires like a clinical therapist / cosmetologist, things like that. So she would be then out of her scope of practice. She might argue, but it's not because I have it, but that's not the capacity you're working in. So that's where the issue comes in. So other examples that could come up is I worked with a social worker that was a mental health nurse in Germany. She knew a lot. So I would ask her stuff, but she could never tell clients stuff. Like I'd be like, what about this medicine? And she'd be like, oh no, this will do this and that. She would never be able to tell them that kind of stuff because that's, although it's in her scope of practice as a nurse, she's not functioning in that way. So you want to make sure, and you really want to be careful, because what I see a lot with social workers is a lot of times they've had their own versions of treatment, and so they're constantly going out of their scope of practice. Well, I remember when my doctor put me on Wellbutrin, it was very helpful, so you should really ask them. That's totally not appropriate. You are not a doctor. You do not encourage or discourage. You always refer back to the psychiatrist. Don't do that. I say it all the time. Oh, you should ask for like some stimulant. That would help. Oh, well, it's nice to see that you're a doctor. I see your notes. You can barely write, so it's kind of in line. I can't understand your writing either. So this is the actual CSW scope of practice in California law. So again, there's different scopes of practice depending on the state you're in. So if you move states, just find out what it is. It's going to change everything. Well, maybe not dramatically. Well, it could. But California's pretty rigid. If you can get licensed and do stuff in California, you can do it anywhere. If you can get licensed and function within California, you can practice anywhere because it has more rigid standards. So I don't know if it's still the case, but I had a coworker who had a BSW, and in their state, this was maybe 10 years ago, they were able to get licensed with the BSW. So it varies from state to state. So you if you move, You need to know that. You never provide services if you're in California to someone in another state. Because it's just, you don't do that.
Are there any states that acknowledge the California license? Because I know ours doesn't acknowledge any other states that we use.
I would imagine, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I imagine probably a lot of them do, because we have everything's harder. The bar's harder in California, everything's harder in California.
I looked it up and it says no on paper. So I wonder if it's just like if you were to ask a specific agent.
It's who you pay.
Social workers make such a
Yeah, you'd be like, here's a Washington $1.25. What do you say now? You're like, half-eaten burrito? Yeah, okay. One time I had a consumer that was a sex worker, and I'm like, how are you doing? I'm so upset. I said, well, and they're like, they offered me a half-eaten burrito. And I was like, how dare they do that? And I'm like, did you take it? Like, no. I'm like, good, gosh. Yeah, so this is just for you if you want to look at it. It basically goes over who we can work with. So we function within, we have special knowledge about resources, human capacity, the part of the unconscious and motivating behavior. We can work with individuals, families, groups, providing information and referral services, on and on and on. So basically it's telling us what we can do. So what's the difference between scope of competency and scope of practice? Because they sound really similar. The main difference is that scope of practice is legal, scope of competency is ethical. So if you're not acting within your scope of competency, you're not violating a legal law, but you might be doing unethical behavior. Scope of practice applies to all people within the profession. Scope of competency applies to social workers specifically. That doesn't make any sense. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. That does make sense. So scope of practice applies to everyone that's in the social work. The scope of competence depends on you. You have your own specific scope of competence based on who you've worked with, education that you have, training that you have, things like that. Scope of practice is defined by law. Scope of competency is defined by social workers' education, training, and experience. So it is a little gray. Just personally, what I would look at scope of competency, if you go to a 101 training at the county or your job on CBT, you're not trained in CBT. Like when I did EMDR training, I had to do 50 hours of training and 20 hours of consultation. Where I talked to someone who was experienced and said, these are the issues I'm having, and then they would give me feedback. And then I'd realize I was doing the whole intervention wrong. This is why you want to get trained. So I'm like, well, that's what made sense to me. And they're like, no, don't do that. So don't just go like, oh, I went to a couple trainings. Like I teach psychodynamics and I go to psychoanalytical trainings and Jungian trainings all the time. I wouldn't post that I'm specially trained in that because I haven't finished like a general certificate. Like they have a certificate program. I do know a lot, but I don't know if it's a sufficient education to really qualify me for that. And if you take it with me, you might be like, it really wasn't a sufficient education for psychodynamics. So you don't just do it because you went to a training. You really need to make sure, but there's no clear guideline. But it's really on you to prove that. So if you worked with a couple people that caught, and then you're like, I specialize in self-harm. It's really on you. Like if something happened and then there was something with BBS got involved, they would look at, did you really have enough information? Did you really have enough training? Did you really have enough experience? Scope of competency can be expanded. Scope of practice can only be expanded by getting additional licensing. So going back and getting your MD or getting a psychology PhD or PsyD. Scope of competency is expanded through training, education, consultation, supervision, and experience. So we'll go into scope of competency, and then I'll give me a second, and I'll do some questions, and you guys can try to answer it, and then I'll explain the concept with whatever the correct answer is. So when you're done with your MSW, you have a really limited scope of competence. One thing that is a benefit with this program is you have a pretty intensive CBT course because it's 5 units, your last one. I would say you're pretty trained in that, just given how much you're doing. I mean, it's pretty intensive. Yeah, you'll have a little bit with psychodynamics, not a ton, depending on who teaches it too. Because a lot of it's like theoretical, and you have to know how to actually like use it. Like just because you can trace it back to mommy was bad mommy, how's that gonna change anyone's life? They're just like, yes, it's validated, and like Mother's Day's coming, put it on a card. So, ha ha ha, you guys are so serious. So even after you have more experience or become licensed, you still have a limited scope of competence. So for instance, I've kind of worked with autism, but not in a super clinical framework. So I'm not going to take autistic clients on. Well, I'll explain to you actually in a minute kind of what you would do. But if you don't have that training, it's not really helpful. The challenge that comes up is when you don't know. So how many of you guys all in internship? Yeah. So have you guys ever had someone that comes in for like some problem, like I can't finish my homework? Like when I did my first year, it was RCOE, so it was schools like non-public schools, and they're like, you're just gonna work on homework, and why they're yelling at the teachers? So I'm like, oh, this is great. First, like 4 clients, I've been sexually abused and raped. What? Like what? We'll go back to history. So what happens is someone comes in saying they need help with blah, 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 blah. You do an assessment, you're developing a therapeutic relationship, and then they drop the bomb. I was tortured for 15 years. And you're like, I had a lot of layovers in my last flight. It was hard too. I don't know. When that happens, then you have an issue because it's out of your scope of competence, but you can't just abandon someone. So if you're thinking like, oh, this is good because then I can get rid of all the crap, like the clients, like, oh, sorry, out of my scope of competence and patience. So you can't just abandon someone like, oh, I can't do it. So then what you have to do is you go to them and you say, hey, this is my training. I have this amount of training. I have not worked with that. There are a couple options. One is you could continue with me, and then I would get consultation. So you would then, you wouldn't go just to any peer, you'd go to someone that specializes in that. It's not just enough, like, some students that I've had in the past will contact me to, like, do their supervision for their license. The challenge is that if I've not worked in that setting, although I've worked with a lot of people, that's out of my scope of competence. Like, I'm not comfortable doing it. Could I technically? Totally. But I won't understand the ins and out of that. So you don't just go to someone seasoned, you go to someone that actually specializes. So if you start working with someone and then you find out that they're bulimic and you're like, I've never worked with an eating disorder, then what you would do is you would seek out supervision, but like with eating disorders, they're way complex. And you really need to. I mean, I remember at San Bernardino County, we had an eating disorder specialized unit. They went to a 1-day training. Not consulting with them. They're like, yeah, this is what happens. And I'm like, okay, yeah. So you go to someone that does have that, and you might have to pay for it. Usually you do, because everyone wants money. So you could present that. This is what I could do. I could also get more trainings specifically towards that, and then I would have supervision. The other option is I could connect you with someone who is specialized. Which one do you want to do? And then they have that informed decision. You know, I really like you. I think I want to stick with you. Or they're like, I knew I should have gotten a PhD. It all makes sense. And then you're like, okay. And then you link them to someone that has that specialization. So it's good when you graduate, keep people's numbers so that you have referrals. Like, if you have someone that has really complex trauma, that wants to get better quicker or doesn't want to talk, EMDR perfect. Find people then you can say, hey, I don't specialize in this, but I really suggest you go here. Or if you have someone who, like an eating disorder, usually you need a multidisciplinary team. It's not really recommended that you only treat it with therapy because it's complex. There's a lot of pieces. So you might then say, oh, I met someone and they work for this interdisciplinary team that does blah, blah, blah. I'm going to connect them to that. But ultimately, it's the consumer's choice, and most of the time, you don't know that they're out of your scope of competence until you've already developed a relationship.
So do you think several forms of specialties, or just kind of zoom in on one?
It depends. So if you want to make a lot of money, so it depends on your motivation. And there's nothing wrong if that's what you want to do. If you want to make a lot of money, specialize. Because you can charge whatever you want. Like if I did EMDR in a private practice, I could charge like $300 a session and get it cash. Because it's a specialized training, you know. What I would suggest, it's hard to because you don't want to get into too many things so that you don't have a rich understanding of anything. Like you're just constantly going to like acceptance commitment therapy, CBT, you're moving around. I do recommend getting, when you're finished with school, getting some deeper trainings that go more in depth with one kind of intervention. So that you can go deeper and see if it jives with you. And then you also want to have multiple skills depending on the person. So like I love psychoanalysis, and I could, you know, if I still teach it, you guys can come. We do Beyonce's Lemonade for self-psychology. It's like the coolest ever. And we do another visual album by Melanie Martinez. Love that stuff. But is that going to work for everyone? Absolutely not. If someone has a delay, or they have defenses that don't allow them to access that, or they might not see it as relevant. So, like, I remember a family that I was working with a few years ago. I was just getting background assessment. Most people, they either, like, hate psychoanalysis, or they like it. There's, like, nowhere in between. So, I'm just getting back. Tell me about how you guys were raised. Oh, you know, we had parents. Really? Oh, my gosh. How many? We grew up like this. We're going through. I'm just like, because I'm just trying to get an idea of like what were the models of way that people parent and family systems. They need to know that to figure out how to intervene. Hit something, the dad gets red-faced, and it's like, this is not important. And I was like, all this red-face says it is. Why are you asking this? This is not why we're here. Oh, and he was like getting really, and so I was like, okay, we don't have to. So, like, that would not be effective for me to constantly reintroduce that. Would it have helped them? Totally. There was one time, and I told we worked for like a year and a half, and I said, this will kill you, but I really want to do it. And we did this thing. It was an old psychoanalysis text that I purchased, and it talked about, it was using people's psyches in comparison to World War II. So it's talking about bombs and how where bombs explode is the thinnest part of the bomb. That's where it explodes. So I told him, I said, you're going to die, like, emotionally. But, like, I've had to deal with you, so you've had to deal with me. Because the other family members were, like, totally into it. And so I said, I read him the whole thing. First he's like, Mac, why are we talking about World War II? And I'm like, because it's going to happen when you reunify. Like, I can already see. And we went through, and I said, so what is, you guys are a bomb, and where are your thin parts? And we went through that, really helpful. Wasn't a huge fan, but he was agreeable. Like, we had enough relationship, and I didn't do it all the time. I did it once, and I treated them for like a year and a half. So you want to get a lot of options, because if I only was psychoanalytically driven, I wouldn't have helped them. Because I would have just come back, oh, this is you're reenacting your childhood. They probably wouldn't have came. It would have damaged our relationship, because not every intervention is effective for people. You know, some people don't want to stop. They just want it to not hurt or something like that. You know, like so I would recommend getting a few and continuing to learn throughout. So you have continuing education that you have to do. And I would recommend spending your money wisely. Not just doing it because it's online, but actually going to things that you're like, that looks interesting. So that you're actually getting, like Leap, that was one of them. I had a flight to San Francisco. I'm pretty cheap, so I was like, I don't know, I got to pay like $400 and then fly up there. What if it sucks? Best money ever spent, but you don't know. But I could have just done like online trainings where someone's like talking on a video and you fast forward to the end and pass the quiz. So use it so that you can get exposed to different things because you're not going to get exposed to. Loma Linda, I do have to say, and I know I work here, but like they give you a lot of exposure to stuff. Like you get a pretty deep understanding of research. There were other when I was here as the Title IV rep, so we went up to Sacramento. There were people writing dissertations that didn't understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. That's kind of a big problem. Like I'm like, what kind of qualitative or quantitative? Oh, it's just like the research, the dissertation. I'm like, oh my gosh. And then you get exposed to like a lot of trauma informed. You get crisis, everything. I mean, trauma informed is just like woven into everything. You get psychodynamics, you get CBT, you get crisis response, you get co-occurring. Like I feel like you get a lot of taste, but nothing's going to be deep enough. So then you pick which ones you're like, yeah, that's good. And don't always go by the teacher because maybe the teacher's just not great at explaining it. You know, don't go like, oh, it sucks. If any part of it looked interesting, then when you're done, then you want to go forward and deepen your understanding. Maybe get some other licenses or certificates. And of course, consultation. That's so important. Hopefully when you guys leave, you understand that if it's possible, get consultation. Because like when you're your first job, likely everyone's going to be out of scope of competence. Because you're working Tier 3 counting. So it's the most severe ever. And they're like, here, you just finished graduate school, here's this. And you're like, this is like all my classes mixed in one. And it has a 9. This is crazy. So you can't, and so that's also where like if you get rigid, like I had someone I worked with that I also taught here, and they were very like idealistic, and I appreciated that. But one day they were like, this is ethical, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, slow it down. You can't help people. Like technically, you can't work with anybody because that's your competency. So you're violating your ethics. Like that's the thing. It's not so clear like that because you're doing what's in the best interest. You're looking at least harm. If there is no one else, like you're working in a place where people have no resources, no income, that's not sufficient to say you really need to get a specialist and blah, 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 blah. You're all they have. They have you, like in my case, they had me or the coworker that ended up sleeping with clients. It's like, do you want mental healing, sexual healing? I'm not sure. So yeah, I mean, sometimes you do have to. It's not that clear, like, because you'll get people like that are a little bit more like everything's, and it's not. Like sometimes you do things, you do as best as you can, but what do you do then? They just never get help, and that's kind of what happens for a certain segment of our population. They just never get help. Because people are like, well, I'm technically following my ethics, and I don't know how to work with schizophrenia. Well, there is no one else. So then you're violating your value of service. You know what I mean? Like it gets a little trickier. So let me